You are about to think of someone you have not thought about in months, and within hours of the thought, that person will contact you. You will be reading a book and encounter a specific concept, only to hear that exact concept mentioned by a stranger on the radio later that day. You will face a difficult decision and find that the answer arrives through a chain of apparently unrelated events, each one of which seems to have its own independent cause, but which together produce a sequence whose meaningfulness exceeds what any of the individual events could account for. These experiences are not rare. The standard cultural framework treats them as coincidences in the dismissive sense, with the meaning that the experiencer perceives being attributed to the cognitive bias that finds patterns where no patterns exist. The dismissal is so automatic that the experiences are rarely examined for what they might actually involve. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether this dismissal is actually correct, or whether the experiences point toward features of how reality is structured that the standard cultural framework has systematically overlooked. The starting point for any serious inquiry into this question is what current research has established about the human capacity to perceive meaningful patterns in events. The cognitive science of pattern detection has documented across decades of research that the human mind has an extraordinarily strong tendency to find patterns, even in random data, with the tendency being a feature of the cognitive architecture that has been shaped by evolutionary pressures over millions of years. The work of Daniel Kahneman at Princeton University, summarized in his 2011 book Thinking, Fast and Slow, has documented the systematic biases that the cognitive system exhibits in its judgments about probability and randomness. The biases include the tendency to perceive sequences of random events as exhibiting structure that does not actually exist in the events, the tendency to remember confirmations of expected patterns more readily than disconfirmations, and the tendency to construct causal narratives that link unrelated events into apparently meaningful sequences. The specific cognitive biases that Kahneman and his collaborators have documented across decades of research include several that are directly relevant to the perception of meaningful coincidences: the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge probability based on how easily examples come to mind, leads people to overestimate the frequency of memorable events and to underestimate the frequency of unremarkable events. The representativeness heuristic, the tendency to judge probability based on similarity to prototypical examples, leads people to perceive meaningful connections between events that share superficial features, even when the connections have no statistical basis. The narrative fallacy, the tendency to construct coherent stories from disparate events, leads people to perceive sequences of independent events as expressions of underlying purpose, even when the events have no meaningful relationship to each other. The convergence of these various biases produces the specific cognitive context within which apparent meaningful coincidences are experienced, with the biases substantially shaping which events the experiencer notices, remembers, and connects. The earlier foundational work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, conducted across their decades-long collaboration before Tversky's death in 1996, established the empirical basis for the framework that subsequent research has continued to develop. Their 1974 paper in Science on Judgment Under Uncertainty articulated the general framework within which the specific biases were identified, with the paper providing one of the most influential foundations for contemporary cognitive science. The work has been extended by numerous subsequent researchers, with the framework now constituting one of the most thoroughly documented areas of contemporary psychology. The implications for the perception of meaningful coincidences are direct, with the documented biases providing substantial explanatory resources for many specific cases of apparent coincidence experience. The work of Michael Shermer, the founder of the Skeptics Society and the editor-in-chief of Skeptic magazine, has developed the implications of these cognitive biases for the specific question of meaningful coincidences. Shermer's framework, articulated in his 2011 book The Believing Brain, and in numerous subsequent publications, treats the perception of meaningful coincidences as the product of what he calls patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in noise. The framework holds that the perception of meaningful coincidences arises from the operation of cognitive systems that evolved to detect genuine patterns in the environment, with the systems being calibrated to err on the side of finding patterns that do not exist rather than missing patterns that do. The calibration was adaptive in the ancestral environment, where the cost of missing a real pattern, such as the presence of a predator, was higher than the cost of perceiving a pattern where none existed. The cognitive systems that produce this calibration continue to operate in the contemporary environment, with the perception of meaningful coincidences being one of the consequences of their continued operation. The honest acknowledgement of these findings is that they account for a substantial portion of what people report as meaningful coincidences. Many of the experiences that strike the experiencer as profoundly meaningful are, on careful examination, the products of the cognitive biases that contemporary research has documented. The base rate of unusual events is substantial enough that some apparent coincidences are statistically expected within any sufficiently long sequence of experience, with the cognitive systems then selectively remembering and emphasizing the apparent coincidences while forgetting the much larger number of non-coincidental experiences. The confirmation bias amplifies this selective memory, with subsequent experiences being interpreted in light of the established expectation of meaningful coincidences, and with disconfirming experiences being discounted or forgotten. The standard cognitive science account of meaningful coincidences is not wrong. The standard account is, for many cases, the correct account. But the standard cognitive science account does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve. There are specific cases of meaningful coincidence that resist easy reduction to the standard cognitive biases, with the cases having been documented carefully enough that they cannot be summarily dismissed. The work of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose engagement with these phenomena across his clinical practice and his theoretical work shaped the modern understanding of meaningful coincidences, provides the foundation for the more careful inquiry that the cases require. Jung's framework, developed across decades and articulated most fully in his 1952 essay, Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle, treats certain meaningful coincidences as instances of a phenomenon that the standard causal frameworks of contemporary science cannot adequately address. The phenomenon, which Jung called synchronicity, involves the meaningful coincidence of events that are not causally connected through any ordinary mechanism, but whose meaningful relationship is too specific to be attributed merely to chance. Jung's articulation of synchronicity drew on his decades of clinical experience with patients whose lives included experiences of meaningful coincidence that the patients themselves recognized as significant. The cases that Jung documented in his clinical work included multiple instances in which the timing and content of external events matched the inner psychological states of his patients in ways that exceeded what mere chance could plausibly explain. The famous case of the golden scarab, in which a patient was recounting a dream about a golden scarab to Jung at the moment, when an actual rose chafer beetle, the closest European species to the Egyptian golden scarab, struck the window of his consulting room, has been the most widely cited example of the kind of phenomenon that Jung's framework was developed to address. The case has been criticized by skeptical commentators who have proposed various explanations, including selective memory and confirmation bias, but the case is one of many similar cases that Jung documented across his clinical practice with the cumulative weight of the documentation being part of what motivated the development of the synchronicity framework. Jung's broader theoretical framework distinguished 4 categories of synchronistic phenomena that the careful observer can identify. The first category involves the coincidence between a psychic state of the observer and an objective external event that occurs simultaneously with the psychic state, with the scarab case being a paradigmatic example of this category. The second category involves the coincidence between a psychic state of the observer and an objective external event that occurs at a distance, and that the observer learns of only later, with the apparent communication between observers at a distance falling into this category. The third category involves the coincidence between a psychic state of the observer and an objective external event that has not yet occurred, but that subsequently does occur, with the apparent precognitive experiences falling into this category. The fourth category involves apparent meaningful coincidences between events that are separated by substantial periods of time, with the meaningfulness being recognized by an observer who connects events that ordinary causal frameworks would treat as independent. The fourfold classification provides analytic structure for engaging with the various forms that meaningful coincidence experiences take, with each category raising its own specific questions about what the phenomenon actually involves. The framework that Jung developed proposed that synchronicity is an acausal connecting principle, with the connections between meaningfully related events being expressions of structural features of reality, rather than the products of any ordinary causal mechanism. The framework was developed in dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli, the Austrian theoretical physicist whose 1945 Nobel Prize in Physics recognized his discovery of the exclusion principle that bears his name, and whose engagement with Jung across decades of correspondence and collaboration produced some of the most striking attempts to bridge the gap between psychological and physical accounts of reality. The collaboration between Jung and Pauli has been documented in the published correspondence between them and in the joint volume The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, published in 1955, which contained Jung's essay on synchronicity and Pauli's essay on the influence of archetypal ideas on the scientific theories of Johannes Kepler. Pauli brought to the dialogue with Jung the rigorous theoretical framework of quantum mechanics and the broader philosophical questions that the foundations of quantum theory raise. Pauli's own engagement with these questions had been shaped by his recognition that the developments of quantum mechanics had revealed features of physical reality that the classical framework could not adequately accommodate. The particular features that Pauli emphasized in his correspondence with Jung included the role of the observer in the measurement process, the apparent non-locality of quantum mechanical correlations, and the deeper question of whether the framework of classical objectivity that had dominated scientific thinking was actually adequate to the structure of reality that quantum mechanics had begun to reveal. The convergence of these physics-based concerns with Jung's psychological observations produced the framework that the joint work articulated, with synchronicity being understood as one manifestation of the deeper structural features that both physics and psychology were beginning to encounter from their own different angles. The personal dimension of the Jung-Pauli collaboration deserves attention because it shaped the conceptual development of the synchronicity framework. Pauli himself experienced significant psychological difficulties during the period of his most intense intellectual development, and he sought analysis with Jung's colleague Erna Rosenbaum and subsequently engaged in extensive dialogue with Jung directly. The dialogue produced thousands of dreams that Pauli reported and that Jung analyzed, with the dream material revealing patterns of archetypal symbolism that Jung had identified as recurring across cultures. The convergence between Pauli's dreams and the broader patterns that Jung's clinical experience had documented was itself one of the data points that motivated the development of the synchronicity framework, with the apparent meaningfulness of the convergences exceeding what mere chance could plausibly explain. The integration of these various lines of evidence into the framework that the joint work articulated produced what remains one of the most sophisticated attempts to think systematically about meaningful coincidence within any tradition. The framework that emerged from the Jung-Pauli collaboration has continued to be influential among researchers working at the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and physics, even as it has remained controversial within mainstream scientific frameworks. The work of Roderick Mayne at the University of Essex, who has produced extensive scholarship on the development and implications of the synchronicity framework, has provided some of the most careful contemporary articulations of what the framework actually claims and what it does not claim. Mayne's work, summarized in his books The Rupture of Time and Revelations of Chance, has emphasized that the synchronicity framework is not a claim about specific physical mechanisms that produce meaningful coincidences. The framework is a claim about the structural features of reality that allow meaningful relationships to exist between events that are not causally connected through any specific mechanism. The distinction is important because it preserves the framework from the criticism that it requires unspecified causal mechanisms, while also preserving the recognition that the documented phenomena cannot be adequately addressed by the standard causal accounts. The contemporary research on meaningful coincidences has continued the engagement that Jung and Pauli initiated. The work of Bernard Beitman, the psychiatrist whose career was spent at the University of Missouri and at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, has produced what is currently the most extensive contemporary research program on meaningful coincidences. Beitman's research, summarized in his 2016 book, Connecting with Coincidence, and developed further in his subsequent publications, has documented the kinds of meaningful coincidences that people experience across their lives, and has worked to characterize the patterns that the experiences exhibit. Beitman has identified specific categories of meaningful coincidence, including human-environment coincidences, in which external events match internal psychological states with specificity that exceeds what mere chance would predict, and human-human coincidences, in which two people experience parallel events without ordinary communication between them that would explain the parallel. Beitman's research has also identified specific contextual patterns under which meaningful coincidence experiences are reported with particular frequency. The patterns include periods of significant life transition, with the experiences clustering around events, including marriage, death of family members, career changes, and geographic relocation. The patterns include periods of psychological intensification, with the experiences clustering around therapy, contemplative practice, and other situations involving heightened psychological engagement. The patterns include states of altered consciousness, with the experiences being reported with particular frequency in connection with dreams, meditation, illness, and the periods immediately preceding sleep and immediately following waking. The contextual specificity of the patterns is one of the features that the standard cognitive bias account does not naturally predict, with the prediction being that confirmation bias and selective memory should produce relatively uniform reports across contexts, rather than the contextually structured patterns that the research has documented. The work has been extended by other researchers, including Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett, whose 2019 book, The Source and Significance of Coincidences, has provided one of the most philosophically articulated treatments of these phenomena within contemporary scholarship. Rowlett's framework, developed through both her philosophical training and her engagement with the empirical research on meaningful coincidences, treats the phenomena as evidence for the kind of broader conception of reality that the materialist framework has not been able to accommodate. The framework is careful in its claims, acknowledging the substantial role that cognitive bias plays in many specific experiences, while also arguing that the residual cases that resist this account warrant the kind of metaphysical engagement that the framework articulates. The work is part of the broader contemporary literature that has continued the engagement with these phenomena across both empirical and theoretical dimensions. The methodological challenges of researching meaningful coincidences are substantial, and the inquiry has to acknowledge them directly. The phenomena are, by their nature, difficult to study under controlled experimental conditions, with the meaningful coincidences that people report being embedded in the specific contexts of their lives in ways that resist the kind of standardization that experimental research typically requires. The reliance on self-reported experiences raises questions about the reliability of the data, with the cognitive biases that contemporary research has documented potentially shaping how the experiences are remembered and described. The base rate problem requires careful attention, with the determination of whether any specific apparent coincidence exceeds chance expectations requiring more information about the relevant base rates than is often available. These methodological challenges do not exhaust what the research has accomplished, but they do constrain the kinds of conclusions that can be drawn with confidence from the available data. What the contemporary research has accomplished, despite these methodological challenges, is the documentation of patterns in meaningful coincidence, experiences that suggest the experiences are not entirely the products of cognitive bias. The patterns include the consistency across cultures and historical periods of the kinds of experiences that people report as meaningful coincidences. The patterns include the specificity of the experiences in cases where the cognitive bias account would predict more general or vague matches. The patterns include the temporal structure of the experiences, with meaningful coincidences often occurring during periods of significant life transition or psychological development in ways that the cognitive bias account does not naturally predict. The patterns provide the empirical foundation for taking the phenomena seriously, even while the standard cognitive science account explains many specific cases. The phenomenon that has been documented across multiple research programs as the most striking specific category involves what has been called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, named after a pattern recognition effect that was first articulated in the 1990s. The phenomenon involves the experience of encountering a specific concept, name, or object multiple times within a short period after first becoming aware of it, with the encounters appearing to be statistically improbable given the relatively low frequency of the concept in the broader environment. The standard cognitive science account treats the phenomenon as a combination of selective attention and confirmation bias, with the experiencer noticing instances of the concept that they would have ignored before becoming aware of it. The account is largely correct, but it does not exhaust what the phenomenon involves in all cases. The specific patterns that some experiencers report, including the appearance of the relevant concept in contexts where the experiencer had no reason to expect it and could not have been primed to notice it, have features that the standard account does not fully address. A complementary line of research has been pursued by various investigators studying what has been called twin telepathy, the apparent capacity of identical twins to share experiences across distances without ordinary communication channels. The research has been controversial, and the methodological challenges have been substantial, but the cumulative documentation across multiple research programs has produced findings that the inquiry has to acknowledge. The work of Guy Lyon Playfair, whose 2002 book Twin Telepathy summarized much of the available research, documented numerous cases in which twins reported experiences that paralleled each other across distances in ways that the standard cognitive accounts did not adequately explain. The cases have been criticized by skeptical commentators, with the criticism focusing on methodological issues, including selection bias and the difficulty of establishing genuinely independent observation. The honest position is to acknowledge the controversial status of this research, while also acknowledging that the questions it raises about the boundaries of consciousness have not been definitively resolved. The work on apparent precognitive experiences in dreams, conducted by Stanley Krippner at Saybrook University and his collaborators across decades, has provided additional documentation of phenomena that resist standard explanations. The Maimonides Medical Center Dream Telepathy Studies, conducted by Krippner, together with Montague Ullman and Charles Honiton in the 1960s and 1970s, established the methodological foundations for subsequent research on these phenomena. The studies documented statistically significant correspondences between sleeping subjects and remote concentrating senders, with the effect sizes being modest but consistent enough to warrant continued investigation. The methodological rigor of the studies was substantial, and the results have not been definitively explained by ordinary cognitive mechanisms despite decades of subsequent analysis. The findings remain part of the broader research literature on the boundaries of consciousness, with their interpretation continuing to be a matter of active scientific debate. The work of Darrell Behm at Cornell University, whose 2011 paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology documented apparent precognitive effects in laboratory experiments, has continued the controversial engagement with these questions in mainstream psychology. The paper documented effects across multiple experimental paradigms in which subjects appeared to respond to stimuli that had not yet been presented, with the effect sizes being small but statistically significant across the studies that Behm reported. The paper produced substantial controversy and substantial subsequent investigation, with the replication record being mixed and the interpretation remaining contested. The honest position is to acknowledge the controversial status of these findings, while also acknowledging that the questions they raise about the temporal structure of consciousness have not been definitively resolved. The cumulative weight of the documentation across these various research programs suggests that the standard cognitive science account, while correct for many specific cases of apparent meaningful coincidence, does not exhaust the phenomena that careful investigation has documented. The careful position is to acknowledge what the cognitive science has established about the biases that produce many apparent coincidences, while also acknowledging that some specific cases resist this account and warrant continued investigation. The dismissal of all meaningful coincidence experiences as mere products of cognitive bias is not supported by the careful research, even as the recognition of cognitive bias as a substantial factor in many such experiences is well established. The inquiry has to maintain this distinction throughout its engagement with these phenomena, neither dismissing the experiences uncritically nor accepting them uncritically, but engaging them with the kind of careful attention that the documented complexity actually warrants. There is a particular feature of the documented phenomena that points toward the deeper questions that the inquiry will eventually examine. The meaningful coincidences that resist easy reduction to cognitive bias are often experienced by their experiencers as having a specific quality that distinguishes them from ordinary cognitive recognition of patterns. The experiencers report a particular kind of meaningfulness that involves not merely the recognition of a connection between events, but the sense that the connection itself has significance that exceeds what the events alone would account for. The phenomenology of this experience has been documented across cultures and historical periods, with specific descriptions including the sense of being addressed by reality, the recognition that something beyond ordinary causation is operating, and the experience of being placed in relationship to something larger than the individual self. The phenomenology cannot itself establish that the experiences involve features of reality beyond what cognitive bias would produce. But the consistency of the phenomenology across widely different contexts is one of the features that the inquiry has to engage seriously rather than dismissing. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed these phenomena with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Christian tradition has developed extensive theological reflection on what it has called divine providence, the principle by which the events of the world are understood as expressions of divine governance rather than as the products of mere chance. The Islamic tradition has articulated the doctrines of qadar and qadar, the divine decree and its execution, within which apparently meaningful events in human lives are understood as expressions of the broader divine plan. The Hindu tradition has developed the doctrine of karma as a structural principle that connects the moral character of actions to their consequences across time, with the connection sometimes manifesting in patterns that the experiencer recognizes as meaningful. The Buddhist tradition has articulated the doctrine of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, which holds that all phenomena arise in mutual dependence with all other phenomena, with the resulting structure providing a framework within which apparent coincidences can be understood as expressions of the deeper interdependence. The work of Carl Jung in the 20th century has contributed a psychological framework within which these traditional recognitions can be engaged seriously, rather than dismissed as merely pre-scientific thinking, and the convergence between the traditional frameworks and the contemporary research is one of the features that the inquiry will eventually examine in detail. What is striking about the convergence of these traditions is not merely that they all recognize meaningful patterns in the events of human lives. What is striking is the specific structural features that recur across the different accounts. The traditions consistently distinguish between events that are merely random and events that participate in deeper, meaningful structures, with the distinction being articulated in different vocabularies but with the structural recognition being consistent. The traditions consistently develop practices for cultivating awareness of the meaningful patterns, with the practices ranging from prayer and contemplation to specific divinatory disciplines that the various traditions have developed. The traditions consistently warn against both the excessive dismissal of meaningful events as mere chance and the excessive identification with meaningful patterns in ways that lead to magical thinking and superstition. The traditions consistently locate the recognition of meaningful patterns within broader frameworks of moral and spiritual development, with the recognition being one feature of a comprehensive engagement with reality, rather than a separate phenomenon that can be cultivated in isolation. The Sufi mystical tradition within Islam has developed a particular concept that bears directly on these phenomena. The Arabic word tawafuk, which can be translated as meaningful coincidence or auspicious correspondence, has been used across the Sufi tradition to name precisely the kinds of phenomena that Jung's framework was developed to address. The Sufi recognition that the apparent coincidences of human life can be expressions of deeper structural features of reality, with the recognition being one of the features that the spiritual journey cultivates, has substantial parallels with what Jung articulated through his own different methods. The convergence between the Sufi tradition and the modern Jungian framework, despite the profound differences in cultural and theological context, is one of the more striking convergences that the inquiry will eventually examine. The recognition that the cultivation of awareness of tawafuk is part of the broader spiritual development that the tradition cultivates, rather than a separate phenomenon that can be pursued in isolation, has substantial parallels with the warnings that the broader contemplative traditions have articulated against the excessive identification with meaningful patterns. The ancient Stoic philosophical tradition contains its own articulation of these themes through its concept of the logos, the rational principle that structures the cosmos and that connects apparently disparate events into coherent patterns. The Stoic philosophers, including Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, articulated frameworks within which the events of human lives are understood as expressions of the broader cosmic order, with the recognition of this order being one of the central tasks of the philosophical life. The framework has had substantial influence on subsequent Western thinking about meaning and chance, with the influence extending through the Christian theological tradition that integrated Stoic concepts into its own framework of divine providence. The contemporary engagement with these phenomena draws on the Stoic articulations, even when the engagement does not explicitly acknowledge the historical influence, with the framework providing one of the philosophical foundations for taking the question of meaning in events seriously, rather than dismissing it as mere subjective projection. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of what meaningful coincidences actually involve may not be the merely psychological question that materialist frameworks have treated it as. The question may be a question about the structural features of reality itself, with answers that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions are all in a position to engage from their own different angles. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own pre-scientific vocabularies recognitions about the structure of reality that contemporary research is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of experience that have a real basis in how reality is actually structured, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The relationship between current research and the contemplative traditions is, on this reading, one of mutual illumination rather than of competition. The body that reads these words has, almost certainly, experienced meaningful coincidences across the course of its life. Some of these experiences may be reducible to the cognitive biases that current research has documented. Others may resist this reduction in ways that the inquiry has been examining. The question is not whether you have had such experiences. The question is what these experiences actually are, what they tell us about the structure of reality and consciousness, and how the various frameworks that have been examining them can be brought into productive engagement with each other. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the deeper physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work on quantum non-locality, the implicate order articulated by David Bohm, and the broader frameworks within which the documented phenomena of meaningful coincidence can be understood as more than the merely cognitive constructions that the standard framework has assumed. The answers that emerge will not be final answers. The questions are too deep for any current investigation to settle definitively, but the answers will be more substantive than the dismissive rejections that have dominated mainstream discussion of these phenomena, and they will be more rigorous than the speculative reassurances that popular literature on coincidences has often offered. The inquiry deserves its proper seriousness, because the questions it addresses are questions about whether the meaningful events that punctuate your existence actually mean anything beyond what the merely cognitive interpretation would allow. There is something fundamentally unsatisfying about the standard scientific account of meaningful coincidences. The findings we have examined establish that cognitive biases account for a substantial portion of what people report as meaningful coincidence experiences, that the human mind has a documented tendency to find patterns even in random data, and that the various biases identified by contemporary psychology can produce experiences that feel meaningful even when no genuine pattern exists. The cognitive science findings are real. The biases are well documented. The explanatory power of the standard account is substantial. But the standard account does not address the residual cases that resist this reduction, the specific patterns that careful research has documented across cultures and historical periods, and the deeper question of whether the structure of reality might allow for connections between events that the merely causal framework cannot adequately capture. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether contemporary physics has anything to contribute to this question, and what the implications might be for how the documented phenomena of meaningful coincidence should be understood. The answer, when the inquiry is conducted carefully, is that physics has substantial resources for thinking about these questions, but the resources are resources for formulation rather than for definitive answers, and the inquiry has to maintain rigorous discipline about what physics establishes and what it does not. The starting point for this deeper inquiry is the work of David Bohm, the American physicist whose career was shaped by his early engagement with the foundations of quantum mechanics, and whose subsequent work developed a comprehensive framework that has continuing relevance for the questions about meaningful coincidence that the inquiry has been pursuing. Bohm, whose technical work in plasma physics and the foundations of quantum mechanics established his standing as a working physicist, developed across his later career a framework that he called the implicate order. The framework, articulated most fully in his 1980 book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, proposes that the physical reality we ordinarily encounter is what Bohm called the explicate order, the unfolded manifestation of a deeper underlying reality that he called the implicate order. The implicate order is the level at which what appears as separation in the explicate order is recognized as expressions of a deeper unity, with the apparent separations being features of how the implicate order unfolds into the explicate manifestation rather than features of the implicate order itself. The relevance of Bohm's framework for understanding meaningful coincidences emerges from the recognition that events which appear to be separate in the explicate order may have meaningful relationships at the level of the implicate order that the apparent separation conceals. The relationships are not, on the framework, the products of any specific causal mechanism that operates between the events at the level of the explicate order. The relationships are expressions of the deeper unity from which both events derive, with the apparent coincidence being a manifestation of this deeper unity rather than the product of a connection that operates between the events themselves. The framework provides a way of thinking about meaningful coincidences that does not require any specific physical mechanism for the connections, with the connections being more fundamental than the apparent separation that would otherwise require such mechanisms. Bohm's framework was developed in extensive dialogue with the philosopher and contemplative teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti, with the dialogues being conducted across several decades and published in various volumes, including The Ending of Time and The Future of Humanity. The dialogues explored the implications of the implicate order framework for questions about consciousness, reality, and the structural features that connect them. The framework that emerged from the dialogues has continued to be influential among researchers working at the intersection of physics, philosophy, and contemplative traditions, with the convergence between the framework and various traditional accounts of meaningful patterns in reality being one of the features that has motivated continued engagement with Bohm's work. The specific concept of the hollow movement that Bohm developed within the broader implicate order framework has particular relevance for the questions about meaningful coincidence. The hollow movement is, on Bohm's articulation, the fundamental movement of which the explicate order is a manifestation, with the movement being a continuous unfolding and enfolding through which the apparent stability of objects in the explicate order is generated. The framework treats objects not as static entities that occasionally interact, but as relatively stable patterns within the hollow movement that maintain their identity through continuous engagement with the deeper structures from which they derive. The implications for meaningful coincidence follow from this broader framework. The events that constitute meaningful coincidence experiences are, on the framework, particular patterns within the hollow movement that maintain meaningful relationships with each other through their participation in the deeper structures rather than through any specific causal connection at the level of the explicate order. Bohm's work on the implicate order has been extended by various subsequent thinkers, with the work of F. David Peat in particular providing a detailed application of the framework to the specific questions about meaningful coincidence. Peat, who collaborated with Bohm across several years and whose 1,987 book Synchronicity, The Bridge Between Matter and Mind, articulated one of the most extensive treatments of the implicate order framework's relevance to Jung's synchronicity, argued that the implicate order provides exactly the kind of structural framework within which Jung's psychological observations can be understood. The convergence between Pete's articulation and the broader framework that Bohm developed has continued to be influential among researchers working at the intersection of physics, psychology, and contemplative traditions, even as the framework remains controversial within mainstream scientific discussion. The careful position with respect to Bohm's framework requires acknowledging the speculative status of its specific applications to meaningful coincidence. Bohm himself developed the framework's implications for meaningful coincidence in some detail, particularly in his collaboration with Pete, but the application has not been definitively established within the physics community as a whole. The framework is grounded in serious physics, but the application of the framework to specific questions about meaningful coincidence involves theoretical extensions that have not been incorporated into the consensus physics as it is currently understood. The framework offers resources for thinking about these phenomena beyond what the materialist framework allows, but the resources are resources for formulation rather than for demonstration. The inquiry has to maintain this distinction throughout its engagement with these topics, neither dismissing the framework's relevance nor claiming for it more than the framework actually establishes. The deeper context for these considerations is provided by the empirical work on quantum non-locality that has been one of the most striking developments in 20th and 21st century physics. The work began with the famous paper of Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen in 1935, which articulated what came to be called the EPR paradox. The paradox concerned the implications of quantum mechanics for the relationship between physically separated systems that had previously been entangled with each other. Einstein argued that the predictions of quantum mechanics, taken literally, would require what he called spooky action at a distance, with the measurement of one system instantaneously affecting the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein took this implication as evidence that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, with hidden variables that would eventually be discovered to make the apparent non-locality merely apparent. The dispute between Einstein and the proponents of standard quantum mechanics, including Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen School, occupied much of the foundational discussion of quantum mechanics across the middle decades of the 20th century. The dispute remained largely philosophical for several decades, with the experimental tools that would eventually allow it to be settled empirically not yet available. The development of these tools across the second half of the 20th century produced one of the most significant transformations in our understanding of the structure of physical reality, with the results having implications that extend far beyond the original framework within which the dispute was articulated. The resolution of the EPR paradox came through the work of John Bell, the Northern Irish physicist, who in 1964 derived a mathematical theorem that allowed the question of hidden variables to be tested empirically. Bell's theorem established that any local hidden variable theory would produce statistical correlations between measurements on entangled systems that satisfied specific mathematical inequalities. Quantum mechanics, by contrast, predicted correlations that violated these inequalities under specific experimental conditions. The theorem reduced the philosophical question of locality to an empirical question that could in principle be settled by appropriately designed experiments. The first experimental tests were conducted by John Clauser and Stuart Friedman in 1972, with subsequent more refined tests conducted by Alain Aspect and his collaborators at the Institute of Optics in Orsay in 1981 and 1982. The Aspect experiments confirmed the quantum mechanical predictions and refuted the Einstein hypothesis of local hidden variables establishing that the apparent non-locality of quantum mechanics is a genuine feature of physical reality rather than a feature of an incomplete theory. The subsequent development of these experiments has produced increasingly definitive results across the past 4 decades. The loophole-free experiments conducted in 2015 by 3 independent research groups, including the team led by Ronald Hansen at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, the team led by Lyndon Shalm at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder, Colorado, and the team led by Marissa Justina and Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, closed the remaining experimental loopholes that had still allowed for local, hidden variable interpretations. The results were definitive. Quantum non-locality is a real feature of physical reality. Physically separated systems can exhibit correlations that cannot be explained by any local mechanism, with the correlations being established through the quantum mechanical entanglement that connects the systems regardless of the distance between them. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to John Clauser, Elena Specht, and Anton Zeilinger for their work on these foundational tests, with the Nobel Committee explicitly recognizing the experiments as having established the quantum mechanical predictions over the local hidden variable alternatives. What these experimental results establish, when their implications are properly understood, is that the structure of physical reality at the quantum level involves connections between distant systems that exceed what classical physics had assumed to be possible. The connections are not mediated by any signal traveling between the systems, since the correlations occur faster than any signal could traverse the distance between them. The connections are not the result of any information that the systems carry with them from their initial preparation, since the loophole-free experiments have ruled out this possibility. The connections are, on the most parsimonious interpretation, features of how the systems are actually structured at the quantum level, with the apparent separation between the systems being a feature of a more limited description that the deeper quantum mechanical description transcends. The systems are not, in the deepest physical description, separate in the way that classical physics had assumed. The systems are aspects of a more unified structure that the appearance of separation conceals. There is a particular set of claims that has been made in popular literature on meaningful coincidences that deserves explicit examination because it has been the source of substantial confusion. The claims involve the proposition that meaningful coincidences are the direct manifestations of quantum entanglement between the events involved, with the events being literally entangled in the technical quantum mechanical sense, and the meaningful relationships being mediated by this entanglement. These claims have appeared in various books and articles that have presented themselves as bringing the insights of quantum mechanics to bear on questions about meaningful coincidence. The claims have to be addressed directly because they distort what the actual physics establishes, and because they have shaped popular understanding of these topics in ways that exceed what the science supports. The claims are not correct as stated. There is no evidence that the specific phenomena of quantum entanglement, as documented in Bell tests and related experiments, occur between macroscopic events in the way that the popular claims would require. The phenomena that have been documented in Bell tests involve specifically prepared quantum systems, including photons, atoms, and small molecules that have been entangled through specific physical processes. The extension of these specific phenomena to the case of meaningful coincidences between macroscopic events would require mechanisms that current physics does not provide, and the popular claims that have made such extensions have done so without addressing the technical obstacles that the established physics places in their way. The technical reasons for rejecting the popular claims have been articulated by various physicists who have engaged with these questions seriously. The work of Max Tegmark on quantum decoherence in biological and macroscopic systems, conducted across multiple papers and summarized in his work on the foundations of quantum mechanics, has documented that the warm and complex environments of macroscopic systems produce quantum decoherence on timescales that are far too short for the kinds of long-range entanglement that the popular claims would require. The biological systems that have been documented to exhibit quantum coherent processes, including the photosynthetic complexes that have been studied extensively, sustain coherence only at the molecular scale and only for very short durations. The extension of these findings to entanglement between macroscopic events at the scale of human lives exceeds what the physics actually establishes, and the popular claims that have made such extensions have done so without addressing the technical obstacles that the established physics places in their way. The work of Wojciech Zurek on decoherence theory, conducted across decades at Los Alamos National Laboratory, has provided the rigorous mathematical foundations for understanding why macroscopic systems behave classically rather than quantum mechanically, despite the underlying quantum mechanical structure of physical reality. Zurek's framework, articulated across numerous papers and review articles, establishes that the interaction between any quantum system and its environment produces decoherence on timescales that depend on the size and complexity of the system. For systems at the macroscopic scale of human life events, the decoherence times are essentially instantaneous, with the quantum mechanical features that produce non-locality being suppressed long before any meaningful coincidence at the macroscopic scale could be mediated by them. The implications for the popular claims about quantum entanglement mediating meaningful coincidence are clear. The physics does not support the claims, and the claims should be recognized as speculative additions to the actual physics rather than as implications of the established science. The honest engagement with the question of what meaningful coincidence actually involves requires distinguishing what the various physical frameworks establish from what they do not establish. The frameworks establish that the deepest physical structure of reality is more sophisticated than classical thinking allowed. The frameworks do not establish that this sophistication takes the specific form of literal quantum entanglement between the events that meaningful coincidence experiences involve. The frameworks open possibilities that the standard materialist framework forecloses, but the possibilities are possibilities, not demonstrated realities, and the careful inquiry has to maintain this distinction throughout its engagement with these topics. The popular literature that has collapsed this distinction has done substantial damage to public understanding of both the physics and the phenomenology of meaningful coincidence, and the inquiry has to resist the temptation to participate in the collapse even while engaging seriously with the questions that the physics raises. What the careful application of the physics to questions about meaningful coincidence actually offers is the recognition of structural parallels rather than the assertion of mechanistic identity. The relationships between meaningfully coincident events have features that have structural parallel with the connections between entangled quantum systems. The meaningfully coincident events involve a kind of correlation that exceeds what mere chance would predict. The connections between entangled quantum systems involve a kind of correlation that exceeds what classical mechanisms would predict. The structural parallel does not establish that the same physical mechanism produces both kinds of correlation. The structural parallel suggests that the deepest structure of reality may include features that allow for non-classical correlations between apparently separate events, with the specific manifestations being different at different scales, but the underlying structural feature being shared. The recognition of this structural parallel is what the careful physics offers for the inquiry into meaningful coincidence, and the recognition is more substantial than the merely materialist framework allows, even as it stops short of the specific claims that popular literature has often made. The careful position is to recognize what the empirical findings actually establish without overclaiming what they imply. The findings establish that quantum non-locality is a real feature of physical reality at the level of properly entangled quantum systems. The findings do not establish that this non-locality extends to the level of meaningful coincidence between macroscopic events in any directly demonstrable way. The findings establish that the deepest physical structure of reality is more interconnected than classical thinking allowed. The findings do not establish that this interconnection takes the specific form of literal quantum entanglement between the events that meaningful coincidence experiences involve. The findings provide a context within which the questions about meaningful coincidence can be reformulated, with the recognition that the classical materialist framework is not the only available framework. The findings do not provide direct evidence for any specific alternative to the classical framework as the correct account of meaningful coincidence. The honest engagement with these findings requires holding their limited scope together with their broader implications, with the broader implications being significant for how we think about the structure of reality without being licenses for the specific claims that have been made in popular literature. What the actual physics does provide, however, is a framework within which the deeper question can be formulated. The framework does not establish that meaningful coincidences are mediated by quantum entanglement. The framework establishes that the deepest physical structure of reality is more unified than classical thinking allowed, with the implications of this unity for the relationship between apparently separate events being a question that current research is working to address. The careful application of these findings to questions about meaningful coincidence involves the recognition of structural parallels rather than the assertion of direct mechanistic identity. The relationships between meaningfully coincident events have features that have structural parallel with the connections between entangled quantum systems. The features are not the same, but the parallels are not coincidence either, and the inquiry into what they suggest about the deeper structure of reality is one of the central concerns of the contemporary investigation that the inquiry has been pursuing. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests it has provides another framework within which the questions about meaningful coincidence can be reformulated. The block universe interpretation of relativity, articulated most fully in the philosophical work of various physicists and philosophers, holds that the past, present, and future all exist with equal reality, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework derives from the implications of special relativity for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames, with different observers having different definitions of what counts as simultaneous, and the implications for any privilege present being substantial. The framework has been articulated by physicists, including Hermann Minkowski in the early 20th century, and developed by subsequent thinkers, including Hilary Putnam, Brian Greene, and various others working at the intersection of physics and philosophy. The implications of the block universe framework for understanding meaningful coincidence are substantial. If all moments in time exist with equal reality, then the events that constitute apparent coincidences are all there in the broader space-time structure, regardless of where they fall in the experience sequence of any particular observer. The apparent coincidence between an event in the past and an event in the future is on the framework, not a connection between events that are separated by a temporal gap that needs to be bridged. The events are both there in the broader structure, with the apparent gap being a feature of how observers experience time rather than a feature of the underlying reality. The framework does not by itself establish that meaningful relationships exist between events that are separated in the experience time of observers. But the framework removes the metaphysical objection that such relationships are impossible because the events are not simultaneously present, with the question becoming an empirical question about what kinds of structural relationships actually exist in the broader space-time structure. The relevance of the block universe framework for meaningful coincidences has been articulated by various researchers across the past several decades. If the future exists with equal reality to the past on the framework, then the question of how a meaningful pattern could span events that occur at different times becomes a question about the structural features of reality rather than about the metaphysical possibility of such patterns. The events are, on the framework, all there in the broader structure that the framework articulates. The question is, what kind of relationships can exist between events that are separated in time, with the framework allowing for relationships that the merely sequential view of time does not permit? The framework does not by itself establish that such relationships actually occur, but the framework removes the metaphysical objection that events separated in time cannot be meaningfully related except through ordinary causation, with the question becoming an empirical question about what kinds of structural relationships actually exist. The work on retrocausality and the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics by Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators provides additional resources that bear on the questions about meaningful coincidence. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being shaped by both its past and its future. The implications of this framework for meaningful coincidence are speculative in their specific applications, but the framework provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of how present events might be informed by future states can be formulated. If the present states of physical systems are constrained by future as well as past boundary conditions on the framework, then the apparent meaningful coincidences that involve events at different times might have a structural basis that the merely sequential view of causation cannot capture. The framework is grounded in serious physics, but the application to meaningful coincidence involves theoretical extensions that the physics community has not endorsed in any consensus form. The empirical work that has been conducted to test specific predictions of retrocausality frameworks has produced findings that the inquiry should acknowledge. The work of Darrell Bem at Cornell University, mentioned in the earlier examination of cognitive science, documented apparent precognitive effects in laboratory experiments. The findings were highly controversial and have been the subject of substantial subsequent investigation, with the replication record being mixed. The careful position with respect to these findings is to recognize their controversial status, while also recognizing that they have not been definitively refuted, with the questions they raise about the temporal structure of consciousness remaining part of the broader research literature, even as the specific findings remain contested. The relationship between the empirical work and the theoretical frameworks of retrocausality is one of mutual relevance rather than direct demonstration, with the theoretical frameworks providing resources for thinking about what the empirical findings might mean if they prove to be robust, and the empirical findings providing motivation for continued development of the theoretical frameworks. The convergence of these various physical frameworks on the recognition that the deepest structure of reality is more interconnected and more temporally extended than classical thinking allowed provides a context within which the documented phenomena of meaningful coincidence can be understood without forcing them into the merely materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion. The frameworks do not establish any specific alternative to the materialist account as the correct account of meaningful coincidence. The frameworks establish that the materialist framework is not the only available framework, that serious physical and philosophical alternatives exist, and that these alternatives have features that bear directly on the questions about meaningful coincidence that the inquiry has been pursuing. The careful application of these alternatives requires acknowledging their speculative status, but the speculative status does not exhaust their significance. The frameworks open possibilities that the standard materialist framework forecloses, and the possibilities deserve serious engagement rather than the dismissal that they have often received in mainstream scientific discussion. The the position that has been articulated by David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and other contemporary philosophers concerning the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate, provides a complementary framework for thinking about meaningful coincidence. If consciousness is, as the various proto-panpsychist positions suggest, a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, then the relationships between events that involve meaningful patterns may have a basis in the consciousness that constitutes reality at the deepest level. The framework provides resources for thinking about why meaningful coincidences have the specific phenomenological features they have, with the experience of being addressed by reality and the recognition of patterns that exceed mere chance, being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides a precise philosophical vocabulary within which the questions about meaningful coincidence can be formulated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. Chalmers's articulation of what he has called the hard problem of consciousness, developed across his 1995 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and his subsequent book, The Conscious Mind, has provided one of the most influential contemporary frameworks for taking seriously the question of what consciousness fundamentally is. The hard problem identifies the difficulty of explaining how subjective experience arises from physical processes, with the difficulty being that no specific arrangement of physical components seems sufficient to produce the qualitative character of experience that consciousness involves. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence follow from the broader framework. If consciousness has features that resist reduction to physical processes, then the role of consciousness in recognizing meaningful patterns may itself involve features that exceed what the merely physical framework can capture. The framework does not by itself establish what these features are, but the framework provides a context within which the question can be formulated rigorously rather than dismissed. Strawson's articulation of panpsychism, developed across multiple papers in his 2006 book Real Materialism, has provided a complementary framework that takes the fundamental status of consciousness seriously while attempting to integrate it with a broadly naturalistic worldview. Strawson's argument is that consciousness in some form must be a fundamental feature of physical reality, because there is no plausible mechanism by which it could emerge from non-conscious components, with the only alternatives being either to deny that consciousness exists or to accept its fundamental status. The framework has been developed by various subsequent thinkers, including Philip Goff, whose 2019 book Galileo's Error has provided one of the most accessible contemporary articulations of these positions. The implications for meaningful coincidence are that the relationships between events that involve meaningful patterns may have a basis in the fundamental consciousness that the framework articulates, with the relationships being expressions of this fundamental consciousness rather than the products of any specific physical mechanism. The convergence between these various frameworks on the recognition that the deepest structure of reality involves features that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately address provides a context within which the documented phenomena of meaningful coincidence can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The frameworks do not establish that meaningful coincidences are what any specific framework suggests they might be. The frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics and philosophy of mind rule out any deeper account of meaningful coincidence, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics and philosophy, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest forms of the alternative accounts remain speculative, even as they are framed within the rigorous physics and philosophy that have been established. The careful position with respect to all of these frameworks is to recognize what they offer and what they do not offer for the inquiry into meaningful coincidence. They offer alternatives to the materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion, with the alternatives being grounded in serious physics and philosophy. They do not offer definitive answers to the questions about what meaningful coincidence actually involves, with the questions remaining open in ways that current research is working to address. They provide a context within which the contemplative traditions, which have addressed these questions across thousands of years, can be engaged seriously rather than dismissed as merely the products of pre-scientific thinking. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the structure of reality that the contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, about whether the meaningful events that punctuate human existence actually mean anything beyond what the merely cognitive interpretation would allow. Long before any laboratory could measure cognitive bias or any framework existed for thinking about quantum non-locality, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of how meaningful patterns operate in the events of human lives. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to the events themselves, to the contemplative practices that engage these events directly, and to the philosophical reflection on what such patterns must be if they are the kind of thing that careful observers across thousands of years have consistently reported. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that the apparent coincidences of human life are not merely random byproducts of a meaningless universe, but are expressions of structural features of reality that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately capture. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about the structure of reality is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated. The Christian tradition has developed the most extensive theological framework for understanding meaningful patterns in events through its doctrine of providence, the principle by which the events of the world are understood as expressions of divine governance rather than as the products of mere chance. The doctrine has its foundations in the Hebrew scriptures that the Christian tradition received from Judaism, with the recurring narrative pattern of apparently incidental events serving the unfolding of larger purposes being one of the most consistent themes of the biblical literature. The story of Joseph in the book of Genesis provides a paradigmatic example of this pattern, with the apparently disastrous sequence of events that brings Joseph from his father's household to slavery in Egypt, to imprisonment, to eventual elevation as the second most powerful person in Egypt, being recognized by Joseph himself as the working out of a providential pattern that transcends the apparent meaninglessness of the individual events. Joseph's articulation of this recognition, in his statement to his brothers that what they intended for evil God intended for good, has been one of the foundational texts for the subsequent Christian theological reflection on providence. The Apostle Paul, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, articulated what has become one of the most influential statements of the providential framework in his letter to the Romans. The passage in the 8th chapter of Romans, in which Paul writes that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, has been the foundation of substantial subsequent theological reflection on what this working together actually involves. The passage does not claim that all events are themselves good, or that the providential pattern eliminates the reality of suffering and difficulty in human lives. The passage claims that the events, including the difficult and apparently meaningless ones, participate in a larger pattern whose meaningfulness exceeds what the individual events alone would suggest. The framework provided by this passage has shaped the Christian understanding of meaningful patterns in events across 2,000 years of subsequent theological development. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, developed the doctrine of providence with substantial philosophical sophistication. His treatise on the free choice of the will and the broader philosophical work of his City of God addressed the questions about how providential governance relates to human freedom, with the framework that he articulated continuing to shape subsequent Christian thinking on these topics. Augustine distinguished different modes of divine governance, with general providence operating through the regular patterns of natural law, and special providence operating through specific interventions in particular circumstances. The framework allowed for the recognition of meaningful patterns in events, without requiring the elimination of human freedom or the dissolution of natural causation, with the providential governance operating through these structures rather than against them. The convergences between Augustine's framework and the contemporary frameworks that have been examining similar questions are striking, with the recognition that meaningful patterns in events can coexist with the operation of natural causation being one of the points where ancient and contemporary thinking converge. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, developed the Augustinian framework with characteristic philosophical precision. His treatment of providence in the Summa Theologiae articulated the doctrine of divine concurrence, the principle by which God operates in and through the natural causes of events rather than alongside them or in competition with them. The framework allows for the full reality of natural causation, while also recognizing that the natural causation participates in a larger pattern whose meaningfulness exceeds what the merely natural framework would account for. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence are direct. The events that involve apparent meaningful patterns are not, on the Thomistic framework, the products of supernatural intervention that overrides natural causation. The events are the natural causes operating in ways that participate in the broader pattern of providential governance, with the recognition of the pattern being available to the observer who has the discernment to perceive it. Aquinas' broader analysis of providence in the first part of the Summa Theologiae addresses several specific questions that bear on the inquiry into meaningful coincidence. His treatment of fate distinguishes the philosophical concept from the providential framework, with fate being understood as the order that providential governance produces in the events of the natural world, rather than as a separate principle operating against or alongside providence. His treatment of divine knowledge addresses how the providential framework can encompass all events, including those that involve free human action, with the framework articulating divine knowledge as encompassing the actual events that occur, rather than as determining them in advance. The integration of these various analyses into a coherent framework produces one of the most sophisticated treatments of meaningful patterns in events that any tradition has articulated, with the framework continuing to be studied within Catholic theological traditions and within the broader history of Western philosophical thought. The convergences between Aquinas' framework and the contemporary frameworks that have been examining similar questions are striking. The recognition that meaningful patterns in events can coexist with the operation of natural causation, articulated by Aquinas in the 13th century, has substantial parallels with the recognition that contemporary frameworks have begun to articulate about the relationship between the meaningful patterns documented in synchronicity research and the cognitive and physical mechanisms that contemporary research has identified. The convergence is not equivalence, with the specific commitments of the Thomistic framework being substantially different from those of contemporary frameworks. but the structural parallels are real, and the parallels are part of what makes the comparative study of these traditional and contemporary frameworks so illuminating. The Reformation tradition developed the doctrine of providence in directions that emphasized the comprehensive scope of divine governance over all events, with John Calvin's articulation of providence in his Institutes of the Christian Religion being one of the most influential treatments within Protestant thought. Calvin's framework emphasized that no event is too small or too apparently insignificant to fall outside the scope of providential governance, with the recognition of this comprehensive scope being one of the consolations that the doctrine offered to believers in difficult circumstances. The framework has been controversial within Christian thought, with various theologians offering modifications that preserve the recognition of meaningful patterns while addressing the concerns about human freedom that the strongest forms of the Calvinist framework can raise. The continuing engagement with these questions across different Christian traditions has produced a substantial body of reflection on what meaningful patterns in events actually involve. Boethius, writing in the early 6th century during his imprisonment that would end with his execution, articulated one of the most influential treatments of providence in his Consolation of Philosophy. The work, composed in the form of a dialogue between Boethius and the personified Lady Philosophy, addresses the apparent injustice of his circumstances by working through the relationship between fortune, providence, and the deeper structures of reality that the merely surface appearance of events conceals. The framework that Boethius articulated has shaped subsequent Christian and Western philosophical thinking about meaningful patterns in events across more than 14 centuries, with the work being widely read across the medieval period and continuing to be studied within the broader Western intellectual tradition into the present. The Islamic tradition has developed its own sophisticated framework for understanding meaningful patterns in events through its doctrines of qadar and qadar, the divine decree and its execution. The framework has its foundations in the Quran, which contains numerous passages addressing the relationship between divine governance and the events of human lives. The doctrine of qadar holds that all events are encompassed within the divine knowledge and will, with the framework providing the structural foundation within which the meaningful patterns that the inquiry has been examining can be understood. The doctrine has been articulated with substantial sophistication across the Islamic theological tradition, with various schools developing different specific formulations that preserve the basic recognition while addressing the philosophical questions that the framework raises. The classical theological schools of Islam developed substantial reflections on the relationship between divine decree and human freedom, with the questions about how meaningful patterns in events relate to the choices that human beings make being addressed in detail. The Ash'ari school, founded by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari in the 10th century, articulated a framework in which all events occur through the direct creative activity of God, with the human agent being the locus through which the events occur rather than the source of the events themselves. The Maturidi school, founded by Abu Mansur al-Maturidi in the same period, developed a complementary framework that preserved a stronger conception of human agency while still affirming the comprehensive scope of divine governance. The Mu'tazila school had developed even earlier articulations that emphasized human freedom, with the school's positions being subsequently incorporated in modified form into the broader theological tradition. The continuing engagement among these schools has produced one of the most sophisticated bodies of theological reflection on the relationship between divine governance and human existence within any tradition. The Quranic verse 7-172, often called the verse of the primordial covenant or the verse of Besmi el-Est in the Persian and Turkish religious vocabulary, articulates one of the most striking foundations for the Islamic understanding of meaningful patterns in human existence. The verse describes the divine address to all human souls before their embodied existence with the souls being asked whether they recognize God as their Lord and responding affirmatively. The verse has been the foundation of substantial subsequent Sufi reflection on the relationship between human existence and the deeper patterns that the existence participates in, with the framework providing resources for understanding why apparent coincidences in life can have meaningful structures that the merely embodied perspective does not initially recognize. The Sufi recognition that the meaningful patterns in human existence are connected to the primordial covenant, with the patterns being expressions of the deeper relationship that the covenant establishes, has been one of the most influential developments within the broader Islamic understanding of these phenomena. The Sufi mystical tradition has developed a particular concept that bears directly on the questions about meaningful coincidence that the inquiry has been pursuing. The Arabic and Turkish word tevafuk, which can be translated as meaningful coincidence or auspicious correspondence, has been used across the Sufi tradition to name precisely the kinds of phenomena that the Jungian framework was developed to address. The Sufi recognition that the apparent coincidences of human life can be expressions of deeper structural features of reality, with the recognition being one of the features that the spiritual journey cultivates, has substantial parallels with what Jung articulated through his own different methods. The convergence between the Sufi tradition and the modern Jungian framework, despite the profound differences in cultural and theological context, is one of the more striking convergences that the comparative study of these phenomena has revealed. The concept of ilham, divinely inspired insight, provides a complementary Sufi framework that bears on these questions. The tradition recognizes ilham as one of the channels through which the practitioner can receive guidance and insight that the merely cognitive resources of waking life would not provide, with the recognition of the meaningful patterns in events being one of the manifestations of this guidance. The framework has been developed in detail across the various Sufi orders, with the specific practices for cultivating receptivity to ilham varying across the orders, but with the underlying recognition being consistent. The integration of the ilham framework with the broader doctrine of tevafuk produces one of the most sophisticated traditional accounts of meaningful coincidence, with the framework providing both the structural recognition that meaningful patterns are real and the practical disciplines through which the recognition can be cultivated. The Sufi mystical tradition has developed a particular concept that bears directly on the questions about meaningful coincidence that the inquiry has been pursuing. The Arabic and Turkish word tevafuk, which can be translated as meaningful coincidence or auspicious correspondence, has been used across the Sufi tradition to name precisely the kinds of phenomena that the Jungian framework was developed to address. The Sufi recognition that the apparent coincidences of human life can be expressions of deeper structural features of reality, with the recognition being one of the features that the spiritual journey cultivates, has substantial parallels with what Jung articulated through his own different methods. The convergence between the Sufi tradition and the modern Jungian framework, despite the profound differences in cultural and theological context, is one of the more striking convergences that the comparative study of these phenomena has revealed. The work of Said Nursi, the 20th century Turkish Islamic scholar whose Risale-i Nur collection has been one of the most influential works of modern Islamic thought, developed the concept of tevafuk with particular attention to its specific manifestations in the patterns of words and letters in the Quran itself. Nursi's analysis identified specific patterns of correspondence in the Quranic text that he interpreted as expressions of the deeper providential structure that the tradition had recognized in human events. The framework has been controversial within Islamic scholarship, but it has been influential among readers who have found in it a contemporary articulation of what the tradition had long recognized in less systematic form. The convergence between Nursi's framework and the broader Sufi tradition's recognition of tevafuk demonstrates the continuing development of these themes within Islamic thought into the modern period. The Persian Sufi poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, who lived in the 13th century and whose Mesnevi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, addressed the meaningful patterns in events across his vast corpus with characteristic depth. Rumi treats the apparent accidents of life as expressions of the deeper guidance that the spiritual journey reveals, with the recognition of this guidance being one of the central concerns that his poetry articulates. His verses on the meaningful patterns in events articulate the recognition that what appears as mere happenstance to the unawakened observer is recognized by the spiritual practitioner as the working out of the deeper providence that the tradition places at the center of its understanding of reality. The integration of Rumi's poetic articulations with the more technical philosophical articulations of Ibn Arabi and other Sufi thinkers has produced one of the most sophisticated bodies of reflection on meaningful coincidence within any tradition. The Hindu tradition has developed perhaps the most philosophically articulated framework for understanding meaningful patterns in events through its doctrine of karma. The doctrine, developed across thousands of years within the broader Hindu philosophical traditions, treats the events of human lives as expressions of a structural principle that connects the moral character of actions to their consequences across time. The framework holds that the actions of conscious beings produce effects that extend beyond the immediate circumstances of the actions, with the effects manifesting in patterns that the experiencer recognizes as meaningful when the karmic structure becomes available to awareness. The framework has been developed with substantial philosophical sophistication across the various Hindu schools, with the specific formulations differing across the schools but the structural recognition being consistent. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the most influential Hindu texts, addresses the relationship between karma and the meaningful patterns in human lives across multiple chapters. The teaching of karma yoga, the discipline of action without attachment to results, articulates a framework within which the recognition of the karmic structure transforms the practitioner's relationship to the events of life. The framework does not require the cessation of action or the withdrawal from engagement with the world. The framework requires the recognition that the actions participate in the broader karmic structure, with the recognition transforming how the practitioner understands the apparent coincidences and meaningful patterns that the actions produce. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence are direct. The events that involve apparent meaningful patterns are, on the framework, expressions of the karmic structure rather than products of mere chance, with the recognition of the structure being available to the practitioner who cultivates the appropriate awareness. The doctrine of samskaras, the latent impressions that actions produce within the consciousness of the agent, provides an additional framework within which the meaningful patterns in events can be understood. The samskaras are, on the traditional framework, the seeds that ripen across time into the events that constitute the karmic structure, with the meaningful patterns being expressions of the maturation of these seeds in particular circumstances. The framework has been developed in detail across the various Hindu schools, with the work of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras providing one of the most sophisticated articulations of how the samskaras operate and how the contemplative practices that the tradition has developed can engage with them. The integration of the samskara framework with the broader doctrine of karma produces one of the most philosophically articulated accounts of meaningful patterns in events that any tradition has developed. The work of Adi Shankara in the 8th century, whose Advaita Vedanta has been one of the most influential developments within the Hindu philosophical tradition, addressed the relationship between karma and the deeper recognition of non-dual reality across his extensive writings. Shankara's framework holds that the karmic structure operates within the realm of conventional reality, with the deeper recognition of the non-dual ultimate reality eventually transcending the karmic framework, even as the framework operates with full force at its appropriate level. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence are subtle but significant. with the framework providing both an account of why karmic patterns are real at the conventional level and an account of why the deeper recognition transcends the conventional level. The convergence between Shankara's framework and the broader analysis of meaningful patterns that the traditions have articulated is one of the more sophisticated points where the philosophical and practical dimensions of these questions converge. The complementary doctrine of RTA, the cosmic order articulated in the earliest Vedic literature, provides another framework within which the meaningful patterns in events can be understood. The doctrine holds that the cosmos is structured by an underlying order that connects the various levels of reality from the cosmic to the personal, with the order being the foundation of the regularities that the natural world exhibits and the moral patterns that human life manifests. The framework has been one of the most foundational concepts within Hindu thought, providing the structural foundation within which the more specific doctrines of karma and dharma have been developed. The recognition that the apparent coincidences of human life participate in the cosmic order is, on the RTA framework, a recognition of the deeper structure that the merely surface view of events conceals. The doctrine of Leela, divine play, provides yet another Hindu framework that bears on the questions about meaningful coincidence. The doctrine treats the entire manifest world as the expression of divine creative activity, with the apparent randomness of events being understood as the play through which the divine reality manifests itself in particular forms. The framework has been particularly influential in the Bhakti devotional traditions, where the recognition of divine play in the events of life provides a foundation for the relational orientation that Bhakti cultivates. The integration of the Leela framework with the Karma and RTA frameworks has produced one of the most sophisticated philosophical accounts of meaningful patterns in events that any tradition has developed. The Buddhist tradition has articulated a different but related framework for understanding meaningful patterns through its doctrine of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. The doctrine holds that all phenomena arise in mutual dependence with all other phenomena, with no phenomenon having an independent existence apart from its relationships with the conditions that produce it and the consequences that follow from it. The framework provides a structural account of how apparent coincidences can have meaningful relationships, even when the relationships are not mediated by the kinds of direct causation that ordinary thinking attributes to them. The events that constitute meaningful coincidence experiences are, on the framework, expressions of the broader dependent arising that connects all phenomena, with the recognition of this connection being one of the features that the Buddhist contemplative practices cultivate. The metaphor of Indra's net, articulated in the Avatamsaka Sutra and developed extensively in the Huayan school of Mahayana Buddhism, provides one of the most evocative articulations of the dependent origination framework. The metaphor presents reality as an infinite net of jewels, with each jewel reflecting all the other jewels and being reflected in all of them. The image captures the recognition that no phenomenon exists in isolation, with each phenomenon participating in the totality of reality through its relationships with all other phenomena. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence are direct. The events that involve apparent meaningful patterns are, on the framework, expressions of the deeper interconnection that the metaphor articulates, with the apparent separation between the events being a feature of the limited perspective that the metaphor invites the practitioner to transcend. The Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, articulated most fully by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century of the Common Era, developed the doctrine of dependent origination with particular philosophical rigor. Nagarjuna's analysis emphasized that the apparent independent existence of phenomena is itself an illusion produced by the cognitive habits that ordinary perception sustains, with the deeper recognition of dependent origination dissolving the apparent independence and revealing the broader interconnection. The framework provides resources for understanding why meaningful patterns can connect events that ordinary thinking would treat as independent, with the connections being expressions of the deeper interconnection, rather than the products of any specific causal mechanism that operates between the apparently separate events. The Taoist tradition has developed its own articulation of these themes through its concept of the Tao, the ultimate principle that structures the cosmos, and that connects apparently disparate events into coherent patterns. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi and composed in the 6th century before the Common Era, or earlier, articulates the foundational understanding within which the Tao operates as the structural principle of reality. The text holds that the Tao manifests in the world through the natural operation of all things, with the recognition of this operation being one of the central concerns of the Taoist contemplative life. The Zhuangzi, the other foundational Taoist text composed in the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, develops these themes through extensive parables and philosophical reflections that illuminate the recognition of the Tao in the events of life. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-coercive action, provides a practical framework within which the recognition of meaningful patterns in events can be cultivated. The framework does not require the cessation of action or the withdrawal from engagement with the world. The framework requires the alignment of action with the natural flow of the Tao, with the alignment being the means by which the practitioner participates in the deeper patterns, rather than working against them. The implications for understanding meaningful coincidence are direct. The events that involve apparent meaningful patterns are, on the Taoist framework, expressions of the Tao operating through the natural flow of reality, with the recognition of this operation being one of the features that the contemplative life cultivates. The Yi Jing, the ancient Chinese classic of changes, whose origins extend back at least to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, has been one of the most sophisticated traditional frameworks for engaging with the meaningful patterns in events. The text uses a system of 64 hexagrams to articulate the various configurations through which reality manifests itself, with the divinatory practice that the text supports being one of the means by which the practitioner engages with the meaningful patterns that the events of life involve. Carl Jung, whose framework of synchronicity we considered earlier, wrote a substantial preface to the Wilhelm Bain's translation of the Yi Jing, in which he articulated the relationship between the text's framework and his own concept of synchronicity. Jung's preface remains one of the most accessible introductions to the Yi Jing for Western readers, and provides one of the clearest articulations of the structural parallels between traditional and contemporary frameworks for understanding meaningful coincidence. The Yi Jing framework treats the meaningful patterns in events as expressions of the deeper structures of reality that the hexagrams represent, with the divinatory consultation being a means of accessing these structures rather than a magical procedure for predicting future events. The careful articulation of this distinction has been one of the features that has allowed the Yi Jing to be engaged seriously by sophisticated readers across cultures, with the framework providing resources for thinking about meaningful patterns that the merely materialist framework cannot capture without requiring the kind of magical thinking that the careful traditions have always warned against. The ancient Stoic philosophical tradition contains its own articulation of these themes through its concept of the Logos, the rational principle that structures the cosmos and that connects apparently disparate events into coherent patterns. The Stoic philosophers, including Zeno of Citium, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, articulated frameworks within which the events of human lives are understood as expressions of the broader cosmic order, with the recognition of this order being one of the central tasks of the philosophical life. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, written during the periods between his administrative duties as Roman emperor in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, contains numerous reflections on the meaningful patterns in events and on the disposition that the philosophical life requires for engaging with them appropriately. The recognition that the apparent accidents of life participate in the broader logos has been one of the persistent themes in Western philosophical reflection on meaningful patterns, with the framework continuing to influence contemporary thinking on these questions. The Stoic concept of sympathia, the cosmic sympathy through which all parts of the universe participate in the operation of the whole, provides a complementary framework within which the meaningful patterns in events can be understood. The framework holds that the various phenomena of the cosmos are connected through their common participation in the logos, with the connections being expressions of the underlying unity rather than the products of any specific causal mechanism that operates between the apparently separate events. The framework has substantial parallels with the Bohmian implicate order framework that the inquiry has examined, with both frameworks recognizing that meaningful relationships can exist between events that the merely materialist framework would treat as independent. The convergence between the ancient Stoic framework and the contemporary physical framework, despite the profound differences in their methods and contexts, is one of the more striking convergences that the comparative study of these traditions has revealed. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context and theological commitment, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about meaningful patterns in events. The traditions consistently treat the apparent coincidences of human life as significant, rather than as merely random, with the significance being articulated in different ways across the different traditions, but with the structural recognition being consistent. The traditions consistently distinguish between events that are merely random and events that participate in deeper meaningful structures, with the distinction being articulated through different vocabularies, but with the structural recognition being shared. The traditions consistently develop practices for cultivating awareness of the meaningful patterns, with the practices ranging from prayer and contemplation to specific divinatory disciplines that the various traditions have developed. And the traditions consistently warn against both the excessive dismissal of meaningful events as mere chance and the excessive identification with meaningful patterns in ways that lead to magical thinking and superstition. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian providentia is not the Islamic qadar, is not the Hindu karma, is not the Buddhist pratitya samutpada, is not the Taoist Tao, is not the Stoic logos. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that meaningful patterns in events are real features of how reality is structured, that the cultivation of awareness of these patterns is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage seriously with what the traditions have been articulating across thousands of years. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research that has been documenting meaningful patterns in events, suggest for how a person can inhabit the embodied existence in which meaningful coincidences are one of the principal forms of engagement with the deeper structures of reality. The meaningful coincidences that have punctuated your life across the years of your existence are not the merely random events that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss them as. The events that you have experienced, the chance encounters that produce significant relationships, the apparent accidents that led to major life developments, the seemingly trivial occurrences that turned out to have lasting consequences, are not entirely the products of cognitive bias and confirmation bias and selective memory. Some of them are. Many of them are. The standard cognitive science framework explains a substantial portion of what people report as meaningful coincidence with the explanation being well documented and the explanatory power being substantial. But the standard framework does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve. The cumulative weight of the careful research, the structural parallels with the contemporary physics, and the convergent recognitions of the contemplative traditions across thousands of years suggest that meaningful patterns in events are real features of how reality is structured, with the recognition of these patterns being one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit a life in which meaningful coincidences are among the most striking forms of engagement with the deeper structures of reality. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist position that has been the dominant framework in mainstream cognitive science for the past several decades. The position holds that meaningful coincidences are, at their deepest level, products of the cognitive biases that contemporary research has documented. The work of Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and their many subsequent collaborators has established that the human mind has powerful tendencies to find patterns even in random data, to remember confirmations of expected patterns more readily than disconfirmations, and to construct causal narratives that link unrelated events into apparently meaningful sequences. The work of Michael Shermer on patternicity has extended these findings to the specific question of meaningful coincidence experiences, with the framework providing substantial explanatory resources for many of the cases that people report. The position has serious defenders within contemporary psychology, and the cognitive biases that the position identifies are well-documented features of how the human mind actually operates. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist account does explain a substantial portion of meaningful coincidence experiences, with many specific cases being well accounted for through the operation of these biases. The second objection follows from the first and concerns the question of whether the residual cases that resist the cognitive bias account actually require any framework beyond what the materialist position provides. The skeptical position is that the residual cases are themselves products of the same biases, operating at slightly more sophisticated levels, with the experiencer's recognition that some specific case seems to exceed cognitive bias, being itself a manifestation of the bias toward perceiving meaningful patterns. The position is internally coherent, and the inquiry has to acknowledge that it cannot be definitively refuted from within the available evidence. The careful response is not to claim that the residual cases definitively establish the existence of meaningful patterns beyond what cognitive bias would produce, but to observe that the cumulative weight of the documentation across multiple research programs and across the consistent recognitions of the contemplative traditions provides cumulative evidence that warrants continued investigation, rather than summary dismissal. The skeptical position is reasonable. The careful inquiry that resists the position is also reasonable. The question of which position is correct is an empirical question that current research has not definitively settled. The third objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical extensions that we have considered. The Bohm implicate order framework, while grounded in serious physics, has not been incorporated into the consensus physics of the mainstream community. The block universe interpretation of relativity, while technically correct as a mathematical framework, has not been established as the correct interpretation of the physical reality that relativity describes. The retrocausality frameworks of Aharonov while taken seriously by some physicists, remain controversial within the broader physics community. The application of any of these frameworks to specific questions about meaningful coincidence involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The honest acknowledgement is that the philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about meaningful coincidence beyond the materialist framework, but the frameworks do not by themselves establish that meaningful coincidence is what these frameworks suggest it might be. The fourth objection focuses on the popular abuse of the inquiry's themes in contemporary spiritual literature. The recognition that meaningful patterns may have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive has been seized upon by various popularizers to develop frameworks that exceed what either the science or the traditions actually support. The claims that include specific predictions of future events through dream symbolism, the claims that include elaborate mythologies about cosmic intelligences directing personal lives, the claims that include manifestation techniques for using meaningful coincidences to attract specific outcomes are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach that meaningful patterns have dimensions beyond the merely cognitive, but they taught this within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist reduction, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The popular claim that the universe is sending personal messages to specific individuals through meaningful coincidences deserves particular examination because it has become one of the most common popular distortions of the inquiry's themes. The claim, in its standard popular form, treats meaningful coincidences as direct communications from a cosmic intelligence that knows and addresses the specific individual experiencing them. The claim is not what the contemplative traditions actually teach. The Christian tradition teaches that providence operates through the natural causation of events rather than through specific personal messages, with the recognition of meaningful patterns being available to those who cultivate the discernment that the tradition has developed across centuries. The Islamic tradition teaches that Qadar encompasses all events within the divine knowledge and will, with the recognition of meaningful patterns being part of the broader engagement with religious life rather than the reception of specific personal directives. The Hindu tradition teaches that karma operates through the natural unfolding of consequences from actions, with the recognition of meaningful patterns being one feature of the broader path of liberation rather than a channel for specific guidance. None of these traditions teaches the cosmic message doctrine in the form that contemporary popular literature has presented it. The doctrine is a contemporary cultural construction that has been retrospectively projected onto traditions that have actually taught something different. The dangers of the cosmic message doctrine deserve direct examination because the doctrine has produced substantial harm where it has been adopted uncritically. Persons who interpret every apparent coincidence as a direct personal communication from a cosmic intelligence become vulnerable to interpreting any unusual event as having specific meaning for them, with the interpretive habit producing both psychological dysfunction and practical errors in life decisions. The traditions have all recognized the dangers of this kind of interpretive overreach and have all developed resources for guarding against it, with the discernment frameworks being one of the central disciplines that the traditions cultivate. The popular literature that has collapsed these discernment frameworks into the simpler claim that meaningful coincidences are personal messages has done substantial damage to vulnerable readers, with the damage being one of the consequences of the broader cultural confusion about what meaningful patterns and events actually involve. The careful position that the contemplative traditions have actually taught is more sophisticated and more demanding than the popular distortion suggests. The position acknowledges that meaningful patterns in events are real features of how reality is structured. The position requires the cultivation of discernment that distinguishes genuine recognition of meaningful patterns from cognitive projection. The position locates the engagement with meaningful patterns within the broader framework of moral and spiritual development, rather than treating it as an isolated phenomenon that can be pursued for its own sake. The position warns against both the excessive dismissal of meaningful patterns as mere chance and the excessive identification with patterns that the disciplined examination would not support. The position is, in short, a position that requires sustained engagement with the broader life of the practitioner, rather than a quick technique for receiving cosmic guidance. The popular distortion has obscured this sophistication, and the inquiry has had to recover it through careful engagement with what the traditions actually teach. The fifth objection concerns the difference between healthy and unhealthy forms of engagement with meaningful coincidences. The traditions have all recognized that not every relationship to meaningful patterns is a manifestation of the deeper engagement that the traditions cultivate. Some relationships involve excessive identification, with the experiencer treating every apparent coincidence as if it had cosmic significance and making major life decisions based on patterns that may be the products of cognitive bias rather than genuine meaning. Some relationships involve obsessive attention, with the experiencer spending so much time analyzing meaningful patterns that the engagement becomes itself an obstacle to the broader life that the recognition is supposed to support. Some relationships involve passive expectation, with the experiencer waiting for meaningful patterns to direct their actions, rather than engaging in the active discernment that the traditions teach as the proper response to such patterns. The contemplative traditions have all developed resources for distinguishing the genuine engagement with meaningful patterns from these various distorted forms, with the discernment being one of the central disciplines that the traditions cultivate. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires preserving these distinctions rather than collapsing them into the simpler frameworks that popular literature has often offered. The sixth objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Christian Providentia, with its specific commitments about divine governance and human freedom, is not the same as the Islamic Qadar, with its specific commitments about divine decree and human responsibility. The Hindu Karma, with its specific framework of moral causation across time, is not the same as the Buddhist Pratityasamutpada, with its specific framework of dependent origination without persistent self. The Taoist Tao, with its specific orientation toward natural flow, is not the same as the Stoic Logos, with its specific orientation toward rational order. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels, and the engagement requires resisting the temptation to construct a synthetic spiritual framework that combines elements from multiple traditions in ways that none of the traditions themselves would endorse. The seventh objection concerns the temptation to use the inquiry's themes as a way of avoiding the difficulties of actual decision-making. The recognition that meaningful patterns may have a real basis can become an excuse for waiting passively for cosmic guidance, rather than engaging in the active discernment and decision that genuine life requires. The contemplative traditions have all warned against this temptation in their own different ways. The Christian tradition has emphasized that providence operates through human action rather than as a substitute for it, with the recognition of meaningful patterns being part of the broader engagement with conscientious choice rather than an alternative to it. The Islamic tradition has emphasized that the recognition of qadar coexists with full human responsibility, with the framework being a context for moral action rather than a license for passivity. The Buddhist tradition has emphasized that the recognition of dependent origination intensifies rather than diminishes the responsibility of the practitioner, with each action having consequences that extend through the broader web of dependent arising. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires holding the recognition of meaningful patterns together with the active engagement that genuine conscious life requires, rather than allowing the former to function as an escape from the latter. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The cognitive science account documents real phenomena that explain many specific cases of apparent meaningful coincidence. The philosophical extensions provide frameworks within which the residual cases can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of how meaningful patterns operate in human existence. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of cognitive science, physics, and tradition remain distinct. And the implications for how a person can understand the meaningful coincidences that punctuate their existence follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness disappears every night during the deep stages of sleep, only to reconstitute in the morning through mechanisms that current research is still working to fully characterize, has implications for understanding what continues across these disruptions and what might be involved in the meaningful patterns that span periods of consciousness and unconsciousness. The integration of these recognitions with the broader inquiry into what consciousness actually is provides a context within which the specific questions about meaningful coincidence can be situated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The recognition that the bond between persons that we have examined in connection with love includes features that exceed the merely psychological has direct implications for understanding the meaningful coincidences that involve specific relationships. The neurological research on bonded couples has documented that partners maintain neural representations of each other that operate even during their physical separation. The implications for the meaningful coincidences that involve bonded partners, including the apparent telepathy between partners and the specific timing of communications between them, follow naturally from the broader picture. The phenomena are not the literal quantum entanglement that some popular literature has claimed. The phenomena are expressions of the documented integration that bonded relationships establish, with the integration including features that the merely psychological framework cannot adequately address. The recognition that dreams may have features exceeding what the standard cognitive account allows has direct relevance to the meaningful coincidences that involve dream content. The traditional accounts of dreams that anticipate subsequent events, dreams that involve communication between sleeping persons at different locations, and dreams that include information the dreamer could not have acquired through ordinary channels are all part of the broader literature on meaningful coincidence. The phenomena are not definitively established in any specific form, with the Krippner research and the Bohm precognition findings remaining controversial within mainstream psychology. But the phenomena are part of the broader documentation that the inquiry has been examining, with the convergence between the dream and synchronicity research being one of the features that the broader picture makes coherent. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has implications for understanding the meaningful coincidences that involve deceased loved ones. The experiences of bereaved partners that include apparently meaningful encounters with the deceased, whether through dreams, intuitive impressions, or unexpected events that recall the deceased in specific ways, have been documented across cultures and historical periods. The phenomena are not definitively established as involving any specific kind of access to the deceased, with the standard psychological accounts providing substantial explanatory resources for many specific cases. But the phenomena are part of the broader documentation, and the relationship between these phenomena and the broader inquiry into consciousness at death is part of what the larger investigation has been pursuing. The recognition that the deepest physical structure of reality involves connections between distant systems that cannot be explained by any local mechanism, that quantum non-locality is a real feature of how reality is organized at the deepest level that current science has accessed, provides a framework within which the connections between meaningfully coincident events can be understood without forcing them into the merely classical framework. The connections are not the literal quantum entanglement that some popular literature has claimed. The connections are the application to the case of meaningful coincidence of the broader recognition that classical separation is not the deepest description of how reality is structured. The framework allows the documented phenomena to be understood within a physics that has moved beyond classical assumptions, without requiring the specific claims about literal entanglement that the actual physics does not support. The recognition that information may be the fundamental substrate of physical reality, that the deepest structure of the universe may be informational rather than material, places meaningful coincidence within a context that exceeds the merely cognitive. The information that constitutes the meaningful pattern in any specific coincidence experience may have features that participate in the broader informational structure of reality, rather than being merely the cognitive construction that the materialist framework would suggest. The implications for what meaningful coincidences actually involve are significant. If the patterns are informational features of reality that the recognition by consciousness can access, then the coincidences may have a structural basis that the merely cognitive framework cannot adequately address. The recognition that the apparent flow of time may be a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of underlying reality, articulated through the block universe interpretation of relativity, has direct relevance to the question of how meaningful patterns can span events that occur at different times in the experienced timeline. If all moments exist with equal reality in the broader space-time structure, then the relationships between events that involve meaningful patterns are relationships between events that all genuinely exist, regardless of their position in the experience sequence. The framework does not establish that specific meaningful relationships actually exist between such events, but the framework removes the metaphysical objection that events at different times cannot be meaningfully related except through ordinary causation, with the question becoming an empirical question about what kinds of structural relationships actually exist. The implications for the apparent precognitive elements of some meaningful coincidence experiences follow naturally, with the framework allowing for the possibility of such relationships without requiring the kind of mechanism that the merely sequential view of time would demand. The recognition that consciousness may itself be a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, articulated by Chalmers and Strawson and various other contemporary philosophers, has direct implications for how the recognition of meaningful patterns by consciousness should be understood. If consciousness is fundamental, then the recognition of meaningful patterns is not the construction of patterns by a cognitive system that operates on raw materials provided by the senses. The recognition may be the engagement of consciousness with patterns that exist independently of the recognition, with the engagement being one of the principal forms in which consciousness participates in the broader structure of reality. The framework provides resources for understanding why meaningful coincidences have the specific phenomenology they have, with the experience of being addressed by reality and the recognition of patterns that exceed mere chance being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian doctrine of providence, the Islamic doctrine of qadar, the Hindu doctrine of karma, the Buddhist doctrine of pratitya-samutpada, the Taoist recognition of the Tao, and the Stoic articulation of the Logos all converge, despite their profound differences, on the recognition that meaningful patterns in events are real features of how reality is structured. The convergence between these traditional doctrines and what contemporary research has begun to document about the cognitive and physical foundations of meaningful coincidence is striking, with the convergence being neither coincidence nor equivalence, but a structural recognition that the traditions arrived at through their methods, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage with seriously. The traditions, on this convergent reading, were attending carefully to features of reality that have a real basis, with the technical resources for articulating this basis being beyond what the original traditions could provide, but consistent with what they were pointing toward. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical extensions, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to meaningful coincidences than the relationship that the standard materialist framework allows, but also a different relationship than the popular spiritual literature has often suggested. The traditions have all developed practices that cultivate this different relationship, and the practices have served across thousands of years as the means by which the recognition is transmitted from one generation of practitioners to the next. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of cultivation, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the practice of recording meaningful coincidences as they occur, with the recording being both more disciplined and more honest than ordinary memory typically permits. The practice does not require any specific theological commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to maintain a journal in which meaningful coincidences are recorded with as much specificity as memory allows, including both the apparent meaningfulness of the experience and the alternative explanations that cognitive bias might provide. The accumulated record over time provides the foundation for distinguishing the patterns that genuinely exceed cognitive bias from those that the bias adequately explains, with the distinction being one of the disciplines that the engagement with these phenomena cultivates. The methodology that Bernard Beitman has developed in his contemporary research provides specific guidance for this practice. The recording should include not only the apparent coincidence itself, but also the context in which it occurred, the psychological state of the experiencer at the time, and the subsequent developments that may bear on whether the coincidence proved to be genuinely meaningful in retrospect. The discipline of including this contextual information protects the practitioner from the selective memory and confirmation bias that would otherwise distort the record, with the protection being one of the features that makes the practice methodologically rigorous rather than merely impressionistic. A second practice draws on the discernment frameworks that the various religious traditions have developed for evaluating apparent spiritual experiences. The practice involves the regular examination of meaningful coincidence experiences for the patterns that the traditions have identified as characteristic of different sources, with the examination being conducted in the broader context of moral and spiritual development that the traditions cultivate. The Christian practice of discernment of spirits, articulated in detail by Ignatius of Loyola in the Spiritual Exercises and developed further by subsequent spiritual directors, provides one model for this kind of examination. The Islamic practice of istikhara, the prayer for guidance combined with attention to the inner movements that follow, provides another model. The Buddhist practice of mindful attention to the qualities of mental states and their consequences provides yet another. The practices share the underlying recognition that the engagement with meaningful patterns requires discernment that distinguishes genuine recognition from cognitive projection, with the discernment being a discipline that requires cultivation rather than merely intuitive judgment. A third practice draws on the Karma Yoga tradition of acting without attachment to results. The practice involves the deliberate cultivation of engagement with the meaningful patterns of life, without the kind of attachment that would treat each pattern as a directive, requiring specific action. The practice does not require the dismissal of meaningful patterns or the refusal to consider what they might suggest. The practice involves the integration of meaningful patterns into the broader process of conscientious decision-making, with the patterns being one input rather than the sole determinant of choices. The framework provides resources for engaging meaningfully with synchronicity, without falling into the passive expectation that some forms of popular spirituality have encouraged. A fourth practice draws on the contemplative recognition that meaningful patterns are most fully accessible to consciousness that has cultivated the appropriate quality of attention. The practice involves the regular cultivation of contemplative attention through whatever specific form the practitioner finds appropriate, with the meditative practices of the various traditions all serving this function in their different ways. The Christian practices of centering prayer and lectio divina, the Islamic practices of zikr and muraqabah, the Buddhist practices of shamatha and vipassana, the Hindu practices of dhyana and mantra meditation, all cultivate the quality of attention that the engagement with meaningful patterns requires. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment, with secular forms of contemplative practice providing similar cultivation through their own different methods. A fifth practice involves the integration of meaningful coincidence experiences into the broader narrative of one's life, rather than treating them as discrete events that occur in isolation. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that meaningful patterns become most fully visible when they are recognized as parts of the larger pattern of a life, rather than as isolated events. The practice involves the periodic review of one's life history with attention to the meaningful patterns that have shaped the development of the person one has become, with the review being one of the disciplines that the contemplative traditions have developed across centuries. The practice provides a framework within which individual coincidence experiences can be situated, with the situation transforming the experiences from isolated curiosities into parts of the broader trajectory that the conscientious life cultivates. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the experiencer and the meaningful patterns of their life. The relationship becomes less an occasional curiosity about apparent coincidences and more a sustained engagement with the broader structures that the life participates in. The attention to meaningful patterns becomes less an attempt to extract specific guidance from individual events, and more a cultivated awareness that informs how the practitioner engages with the broader trajectory of their existence. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with one of the principal forms in which the structural features of reality become accessible to embodied consciousness, with the deepening being possible across the entire span of the life in which the meaningful patterns continue to occur. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed, a recognition that the meaningful coincidences that punctuate your existence are not merely the products of cognitive bias that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss them as. A recognition that the patterns you have experienced are not entirely the constructions of selective memory and confirmation bias, even as cognitive science has documented that many specific cases involve precisely these mechanisms. A recognition that the structural features of reality that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions have all been working to articulate may include features that allow for the kinds of meaningful patterns that careful observation has documented across cultures and historical periods. The question of whether the philosophical and contemplative frameworks that have been examined are correct in their strongest forms is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit a life in which meaningful coincidences have appeared in light of the recognitions that the inquiry has pointed toward is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The events that constitute your life are not merely the random sequence that the materialist framework would suggest. The patterns that have shaped your trajectory are not entirely the cognitive constructions that the skeptical framework would reduce them to. The persons you have met, the opportunities that have appeared, the difficulties that have presented themselves, the sequences of events that have led you to the specific situation you are now in, may have features that exceed what the merely random and merely psychological frameworks can adequately address. The features point toward the deeper structures of reality that the inquiry has been examining, with the implications for how you can engage with the trajectory of your existence being significant rather than incidental. None of this requires the abandonment of careful skepticism. Cognitive bias is real. Confirmation bias is real. The materialist account explains a substantial portion of meaningful coincidence experiences. But the residual cases that resist this explanation, taken together with the convergent recognitions of the contemplative traditions and the structural parallels with the contemporary physics, warrant the kind of careful engagement that the inquiry has been cultivating throughout. The next time something happens in your life that strikes you as a meaningful coincidence, consider for a moment what is actually happening. The experience may be a product of cognitive bias that the standard framework adequately addresses, or it may be one of the residual cases that exceeds what the standard framework can capture, with the experience being an instance of the structural features of reality that the inquiry has been examining. The discernment between these possibilities is itself part of the practice that the inquiry has been recommending, with the discernment being a discipline that requires cultivation rather than merely intuitive judgment. You have time. The time is finite. The meaningful coincidences that constitute one of the principal forms of engagement with the deeper structures of reality during your embodied existence are not infinitely available to you, with the embodied form of their availability being constrained by the same biological mortality that constrains all other dimensions of your existence. What you do with these experiences, what kind of engagement you cultivate with the meaningful patterns that have been part of your life and that may continue to appear as you continue to live, is among the most consequential dimensions of how you inhabit the existence that you have. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward will not be available to you in the moments when it is most needed as a theoretical framework for analysis. The recognition will be available, if it is available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with the meaningful patterns of your life across the years that preceded the moments. The cultivation matters. The practices matter. The recognition that meaningful coincidences are something more than what the materialist framework allows, while also something different from what the popular spiritual literature has claimed, is a recognition that produces its effects through the gradual transformation of how the experiencer engages with the trajectory of their existence. The patterns will continue to appear. What you make of them is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the meaningful events that punctuate your life. The events of your existence are not random. The patterns of your existence are not entirely your construction. The structure of reality that the inquiry has examined includes features that the patterns participate in, with the participation being something more substantial than the materialist framework allows, and something different from what the popular spiritual frameworks have claimed. You are in a life. The life has shape. The shape is not entirely visible from where you currently stand, but the shape is real, and what you do with the patterns that appear in the shape is the question that no one else can answer for you. The patterns are coming. They have been coming. they will continue to come. What you make of them is the choice that is yours alone to make.